Negavit nos in unum Christi amor, Christi amor.
Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Domestic Church. This is, of course, then a continuation of our new series exploring the practicalities of living and confessing and witnessing to the Christian faith in the 21st century. Now, you may recall that last week we reflected on the way in which our forebears, our ancestors, the early Christians, witnessed to their faith, and particularly you may recall, we looked at the house of St. Peter in Capernaum, and we looked at the excavations there which revealed the gradual development of the Christian home from an ordinary domestic house into a place of gathering and of worship. And so we're going to continue along the lines of that theme, with the idea and the notion being, the point being, that we as Christians in the 21st century really could learn a lot from our early forebears as to how to witness to the faith in our present age. Now, one of the questions that we might ask ourselves, and certainly this is a question that those of you who are familiar with the daily Mass and my preaching, I often ask on the Feast of Martyrs, if Christianity were outlawed today, tomorrow, soon, who knows, what evidence would there be? What proof would there be that you were a Christian? Could your neighbours identify you? Could they grass you up? Could they point to something and say that, oh yes, them at number 32, they are Christians? Now, in the old days, in the early days of the church, of course, the church was enduring persecution for most of the first 3.5 centuries of its early existence. And some of you may be familiar with the fact that this, of course, meant that they couldn't worship publicly, they couldn't worship openly. And some of you who perhaps have been on pilgrimage to Rome will have visited the catacombs. You will have seen those now underground burial places where the Christians used to gather to worship, in part because the pagans were too superstitious to go anywhere near the cemeteries, especially in the dark. And remember that the main focus of Christian worship was on Sunday, but it will begin on Saturday night with a vigil, singing psalms and hymns and listening to sermons long into the night, into the morning, to greet the risen Christ with the risen dawn. And many of our ancient liturgies, still in the Latin Rite, speak to that early praxis. For example, Holy Saturday and the Easter Vigil, or indeed the Pentecost Vigil. So we know that, the early Christians often worshipped in the cemeteries. Also, partly, of course, a consequence of that was that they were surrounded by the remains of their confreres, those who had publicly witnessed to Christ by martyrdom, and whose relics, whose remains had been gathered and then deposited and buried in the catacombs. And often the Christians would gather particularly around those places as an expression and manifestation of our belief in the, as we say in the Creed, the communion of saints. So there was that connectedness between the church militant on earth and the church triumphant in heaven, or the church expectant. Now, of course, that's why to this day relics are placed in Christian altars to maintain that connection. And obviously there is that aspect of the martyrs sharing in the passion of Christ in their martyrdom. So they are connected particularly with the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Now, I'm digressing a bit, so coming back. So we said the Christians, the first 3 centuries, were often enduring persecution. They couldn't worship publicly. How then did they recognize each other? How, if you were a visitor to a town, you knew that there was a Christian church, in other words, you knew that there was a body of Christian believers, how would you find them? How would you discover them? Now, some of you may be familiar with this symbol. It's, of course, redolent of a fish, and it is known as an ichthus. An ichthus, which is an acronym which spells in Greek Jesus Christ, God, Son, Saviour. So we see this depicted in various places from ancient times. A fish sometimes carved into stone near a building. And this was a symbol, a recognized symbol of the Christians. And as I said, ichthus is an acronym. Jesus Christus Theos Huios Sotor in the Greek. Why in the Greek? Because, of course, as I'm sure we've reflected before and you already know, but Greek was kind of the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. Not everybody spoke Latin, but certainly everyone commercially spoke Greek. And Hellenistic culture, of course, was a very great foundation to that developed style of the Roman Empire. So Christians would look out, as it were, for that symbol. If you were visiting a place, you would look out for that symbol to find other Christians, particularly, for example, on a Saturday night or for a Sunday, to find where to go to meet and to gather. It is also, of course, suggested that Christians might draw in the sand like this in front of one another to let somebody know that they were a Christian, etc. So the question then, like that question that I ask on the Feast of Martyrs, what evidence would there be to convict you? What evidence is there about your house, about your home, that indicates to anyone that a Christian lives here? Now, some of you, of course, may be familiar with the Epiphany chalk blessing of houses, where the year is written and the initials of the 3 kings, CMB, for Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, but also in Latin meaning Christus mansionem benedicat. That is a house blessing that is traditionally given at Epiphany tide, and that is chalked above door lintels or window lintels. Now, true to say, it tends to be in many places chalked on the inside, but that might be an indication of a Christian home. But what else from the outside? What else might indicate a Christian home? Think about your own home. Is there anything that is visible from the outside that would indicate a Christian lives there? Now, of course, some of you might be asking the question, well, why would I want to indicate that? Why would I want anyone to know that my house was a Christian household, or indeed that I was a Christian? Well, to which I have to ask, well, why not? Why wouldn't you want to know? The whole point, of course, about our faith, about Christianity, is that the love of God is to be shared. And how can you share the love of God if nobody knows you've got the love of God? And surely one of the ways, of course, to show the love of God is to demonstrably live and express the love of God in your life. And that we may do in the general way in which we interact with others and in our general demeanour and manner and attitude and approach to life that others may pick up from our words and our actions and our deeds, or from the thoughts that we express. But in other ways, in other ways, surely we could express our faith. Now, I, of course, as a bishop, it's customary for a bishop to wear a pectoral cross, so I'm always wearing a cross. But it's a shame that these days fewer Christians, it seems, tend to wear overtly Christian symbols. In the East, of course, our Orthodox brethren are all very hot on wearing crosses, both men and women alike. In the West, it tends to be a very stylized piece of jewelry these days. But if you don't wear a cross, perhaps ask yourself, why don't I wear a cross? I mean, why don't you wear a cross? Why shouldn't you? Now, I do understand, of course, that there have been various employment tribunals where Christians have been taken to task for wearing a lapel cross pin, or for wearing a necklace with a cross in their places of work. And there are all sorts of pros and cons as to that. Of course, it will depend on where you work. It will depend on the risk assessment. It will depend on the health and safety considerations, etc. But it is a shame that more Christians don't wear crosses. Consider that Sikh men, of course, wear their turbans. Muslim women wear the hijab. Why shouldn't Christians also be recognizable? Why shouldn't they wear crosses? But also, too, Ben, and of course, wearing a cross just may invite someone to ask for prayer, as has often been the case in hospital, which has got nurses into trouble, sadly. People might ask for prayer, or they might come and ask you about the cross. Why are you wearing a cross? Are you a Christian? And there's an opportunity to witness to the faith, to give an account of that hope which is in you, as St. Peter says we should always be ready to do. So the cross, of course, then is a sign of contradiction, but also too a sign that it might invite curiosity. But going back a bit, what about our homes? What about our houses? Why should we indicate that our homes are Christian? Well, perhaps we might take a similar attitude that our Christian forebears had, who put the ictus outside their door, either above their lintel or on the side of the door or on the floor immediately outside the step to their house, to indicate to others that a Christian does live here, that this is a Christian household, which should mean that this is a place of welcome, of hospitality. It should indicate that strangers, as well as Christians, but strangers are welcome here. Remember, last week in our reflections, we considered this difference between the way in which Christianity is lived today and the way it was lived in the past. And in noting that Christians often worshipped in homes because of the persecutions, etc., we noted the hospitality of the Christians. For them, their homes were not just homes for themselves, but homes for their brothers and sisters in the blood of Christ. And also, too, homes to a welcome was offered to the stranger. There are still, of course, redolent practices today in old traditional customs, like, for example, certainly in places like Wales and Ireland and Scotland, a long tradition of, especially in wintertime, having a pot of stew on the go, ready to offer to a stranger or anyone who comes to the door. And used to be a very common practice for many families to lay an extra place at the table at meal times, just in case a stranger should come or an unexpected visitor. And why? Well, in part because of what Jesus says. He will ask us on the day of judgment, where were you when I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked, etc. And he asks, where were you when I was a stranger? Meaning, where were you willing to share God's love and mercy toward a stranger? So, with regard to our homes, what could we do then, if we don't already? What could we do to indicate that a Christian lives here? A few years ago, when I was much younger, here in the UK during Holy Week, there used to be a lot of ecumenical services, and everyone used to have a poster. It was purple with purple and white, but basically a purple background with a white cross, actually often a kind of side perspective of a crucifix, rather like the one behind me. In fact, if you can imagine that framed with a purple background and itself as a silhouette in white, and then there used to be the big words, "This is Holy Week," and then people would write the Holy Week services of their church. Sadly, we don't see that much these days, but when I was young, that's always something that's stuck with me. We could, of course, today perhaps put a cross, perhaps outside our door, or if not outside our door, on a windowsill, so that it is visible to passers-by. You know, Jewish homes are indicated by having a little box that sits by their door on the outside, which contains within it little scrolls of prayers. There's no reason why we as Christians couldn't have a cross, perhaps above our doorbell. And remember, it doesn't have to be a huge, great thing like that one behind me. It could just be very small and very discreet, but there nonetheless. But it would indicate, should it have to, for anyone who might need to know, that a Christian lived here. And more than that, that this place was a place of welcome for the stranger. Now think about it, because our churches, of course, we indicate, usually, I admit that some expressions of modern church architecture today are less perhaps obvious, but certainly the kind of conventional and traditional model of churches and chapels, it's very obvious that they are Christian churches or chapels, because usually there will be a huge great cross on the top of the spire, or a great crucifix outside on the wall, as well as, of course, perhaps a notice board saying this is the church of so-and-so, services, etc. Churches are immediately obvious and recognizable. And what are churches? What is the whole point of a church? A church, of course, is essentially a temple. And what is the point of a temple? But it is, of course, a meeting place between God and the faithful. It is a meeting place, we might say, between heaven and earth. The temple in Jerusalem was understood to be such a place. Indeed, the holiest of holies, the sanctuary that was behind the great curtain, inner curtain inside the temple, was considered to be the place where God dwelt on earth among his people. In the holiest of holies was contained the Ark of the Covenant. Two carved cherubim were upon that, making, as it were, a seat of the Ark of the Covenant. And contained, of course, within the Ark of the Covenant was the manna, the collected remains of the manna, that bread from heaven that had been given to the Israelites in the wilderness, and the tablets of stone with the Ten Commandments. So temples and churches are specifically meeting places between heaven and earth, between God and ourselves. Now, what else are temples? What does St. Paul say about Christian baptism? You see, we, by virtue of our baptism ourselves, have become living temples. We have put on Christ. We recognize the image of God that is within us, our spirit. We are seeking to grow into the likeness of God. And the likeness of God we see in the likeness of Christ, of the incarnate God made man, who perfects humanity, restores humanity, in which we desire ourselves, of course, to experience, and we do experience by virtue of our baptism. And as St. Paul says, do you not know your bodies are a temple for the Spirit? Indeed, I hope, that Christ lives and reigns in our hearts, that the Spirit of God is in us. And thus, of course, that makes our bodies temples, makes them meeting places between God and ourselves. But then by extension, shouldn't our homes also be? Shouldn't our homes also be meeting places? If only because it's where we dwell, and God, we hope, dwells within us. Therefore, that makes our home, where we dwell, a temple, does it not? Now, we looked last week at the nature of Domus Ecclesia, and we looked to the house at Capernaum of St. Peter. There is another very famous example of a church house from the 3rd century at Dura Europos, which was a far-flung outpost of the empire, but where the remains of a Domus Ecclesia, of a church house, have been excavated. And here we see a floor plan. So you can see that it's sort of the usual kind of villa or Mediterranean type courtyard structured house. And hopefully you can read there where it says assembly room, which would have been the main meeting place for the church family. To the other side, you will see teaching area there in the middle by the courtyard, and then you will see baptistry. Now, of course, earlier Domus Ecclesia were more like domestic homes, and this clearly, though built as a domestic home, has been adapted and been now used for a church use, so that the baptistry in that house is particularly developed. We see here this is a reconstruction of that baptistry in Dura Europos. But we know that the early Christians made churches of their homes. Their homes were an extension of themselves as a temple, as a meeting place of God. Now, such an idea is not so unusual when we consider, for example, a typical Roman villa of the same period. So if we look here, so this again you can see is a structure around a courtyard. We have there a leafy courtyard covered over, rather like a cloister, an outside area. Then in the center of that raised area, we see there's a central courtyard in that red mosaic floor there that probably would have had water in it as well, and all the various rooms. And here is another example. This is more of your sort of townhouse version of a conventional villa. So you still have that inner courtyard you see there where the water is in that white square. But you can see too this townhouse has shop fronts. So you see the street there. Notice the raised pavement and the sunken road surface and the stepping stones across. That's because everything, of course, was thrown into the street in those days and was washed down by the rain and taken away. And raised pavements were to obviously keep citizens' feet away from whatever was in the roads. Now, not sure that you may be able to see it, but as you're looking at the screen, in the top, towards the top left hand area of this picture, so just above the blue square of water in the inner courtyard, you can see there's what looks like a woman in a red dress. Perhaps that's either a dog or a child. I think she's conversing with. Then slightly to her left, you can see another very well-dressed woman, and next to her, you can see something like a cabinet with what looks very like a temple roof. Now, there's another example in the previous villa. Here, down in the bottom center, you can see there's a woman with a red dress sitting on a stone bench in that cloistered courtyard, and then to her right and to our right, you see there's like a red brick pillar, again with like a temple type roof on it, and somebody in white standing in front of it. Now, these are larias, which are home shrines. Let's give some examples here. Here is another example of a domestic shrine. Here is another. So you see it's rather like a temple portico in miniature with a statue of the deity and reliefs behind. Here we have an example from Pompeii, actually, of a house shrine. This was in the inner courtyard of a villa. And here from Great Whitcomb in the UK, a Roman villa. This is a artist's reconstruction, as it were. But note that the children in the house seem to be offering at a shrine. And in fact, that shrine, if you look very closely, it almost looks like that could be a saint, some kind of bishop, perhaps, in the alcove. And indeed, this particular example, of course, may speak to what existed in Christian homes. So just as their pagan neighbours did, they had little shrines to their gods and goddesses, so too the Christians would have had a focus point for their worship. Now later, of course, when we get to examples like Dura Europos, they're giving then over whole rooms, and specifically to worship, to catechesis, and to baptism. But certainly not every Christian home, of course, would have been used as the church, as the main meeting place of worship, but all Christian homes would have had a place, a focused place for worship. And so, as well as perhaps thinking about what might indicate to others outside our homes that this is a Christian household, what about inside our homes? Now, we did reflect a little about this last week, about developing a place, a particular place within the home as a focus of worship. And last week we reflected on this as something to assist us, particularly when with online worship. And some of you, I'm sure, will have noticed that the video introduction to the program has various examples of contemporary Christian domestic shrines. Here is an example. It's on the one hand, it's nothing incredible. On the other, it's very simple. It's very basic. It's utilizing the top of a bookcase. But there's a little triptych there, a candle, a painted crucifix on the wall, and an icon above, a picture above. I'll just get up another example here. So again, very much the same thing, but with religious icons or devotional aids on the wall. And again, what looks like the top of a bookcase, an open Bible, a couple of candles, a nice upright crucifix. Here is another example. Now this person actually has a couple of saints' relics. That's those two round things on the shelf. Again, a lovely crucifix, framed pictures of the Sacred Heart and the Immaculate Heart, and again a crucifix. So a home shrine, or a domestic altar, we might say, can be very modest, or it can be something a little more substantial like this. And this particular shrine has since developed into literally a home altar. Now the whole point of those is, of course, to serve as a focus place of worship, because, as we reflected last week, as Christians we should be worshipping in our homes. We should be worshipping in our homes. We should be getting up every morning and saying prayers. Throughout our day, we should be sanctifying our lives. Throughout our day, we should be talking to God. We should be sharing with Him our hopes, our fears, our aspirations and anxieties, just as we would anyone else we know. God should be the first person we turn to, both with good news and bad news. And of course, at night, in the evening, we should practice some self-examination and prayers before we go to bed. And what would greatly aid and assist all of that, and to hold in one's mind constantly an awareness of the presence of God, would be to have such a domestic shrine within our homes. Now, as you can see, there are various different ways of doing that. It doesn't have to be an actual full-blown home altar. In Malta, there is a very long tradition of having home altars, which to all intents and purposes look like actual altars. There is a museum, I forget where, with an exhibition of Maltese home domestic altars, with the most amazing Baroque creations, which literally look like the kind of altar you find in a Maltese church, just like that example just then, which this actually is sort of based on, with lots of candles and statues and so on and so forth. Now, but that's not all everyone's taste. You may prefer a more Cistercian or Trappist or monastic cell type experience, rather like here, with just white walls and a big cross. But the point is that we should have a focus place within our homes, which is a sacred space. Sacred because it's where we deliberately interact with God, where we deliberately welcome God into our lives and into our homes, where God is dwelling with us. Now, sadly, for some reason, I'm not entirely certain why, perhaps I think, especially in Northern Europe and here in the UK, and then subsequently in North America, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and particularly here in the UK and then in America, the Puritans. Perhaps there's an aversion that we have, somewhat a remnant of a cultural aversion to overt expresses of religion. Certainly, if we visit the continent, we find in France and Italy and Spain sometimes every street corner there's a shrine, there's a statue to Our Lady, or there's a crucifix, or an icon of a saint, or what have you. But here in Northern Europe and in the UK and America, perhaps because of the Reformation, because of particularly here in the UK because of the Puritans in the 17th century, there is a slight kind of, I think, leftover cultural kind of aversion to such express manifestations of religiosity, which I think, is a great pity, and we should eschew. And instead, we should rather go back to a more early Christian traditional approach, and indeed have within our homes a dedicated place, a place where we may say, this is God's corner, this is God's part of the house, this is where I go to be with God. Now, of course, all of us are experiencing probably different kinds of home situations. Some of us may not be the main person of the house. So we are, perhaps we're in our parents' house, or perhaps we're renting a room or something. So we may not have, carte blanche to put crucifixes on every wall in every room in the house. But nonetheless, irrespective, we should find, and especially if we are only limited to one room, as it were, we should nonetheless make a point of having a particular place. Now, even if it's only one small icon and one candle on the corner of a bookshelf, that's okay. That's okay. And if that will help you to pray, if lighting that candle, if seeing that icon will engender for you a sense of prayer, then that's fine. If you can do more, would like to do more, would prefer to do more, go for it. If you want to recreate a Maltese domestic altar, go for it. And there is something to be said, and particularly for us as Orthodox Catholics and as old Romans, there is something to be said about having perhaps a domestic altar in which at which Mass can be said, can be offered. Certainly many old Roman clergy, of course, will have a domestic altar where they say their daily Mass. And certainly if we want the church to grow, we might think about having a domestic altar and offering our place as a Mass centre, as a place where Christians can gather like the early church for Mass. So you might you might feel moved to create something of an altar in your home. But horses for courses. It really, it doesn't matter how much or how little, how big or how small, how grand or how poor or how simple, but we all ought, as a point, as Christians, have in our homes somewhere that is a focus for our prayers, if only because we all know how easily we can be distracted. We all know how easily we can be distracted. Having a crucifix or having an icon, having a candle should enable us to focus, should enable us to be able to block out distractions and hone in, zone in, we might say, on God. Now, of course, even if we have a domestic altar, it's not likely that we're going to have a tabernacle. It's not likely that for many people that they're going to have the Blessed Sacrament in their home. So God is not literally present, but at the same time, God is, of course, present everywhere, in all times, in all places. But even so, we can then have a sense, an idea of focusing our attention and our awareness of the reality of God's presence in our lives by creating a little domestic shrine, a little place of focus for our prayers. Now, I said last week, and in another series of programs that I did on how to worship online, I suggested then in that series that one's domestic altar, as it were, one's prayer corner, icon corner, whatever you want to call it, you might arrange candles there and your statues, your crucifix, your rosary, your missal, and have enough space there to place your phone or your tablet, whatever it is you watch online services with. The point being that by putting your phone or putting your laptop or putting your tablet or iPad or whatever there, and framing it, as it were, with candles and religious iconry and statuary, that itself then ceases to be a phone, an iPad, a tablet, and instead becomes, like an icon, becomes like a spiritual window. If you visit medieval churches, sometimes you will see that from the side aisle by the altar, often there was a little hole, a little gap, a little tunnel through the wall from the side altar through to the choir or through into the chancel, so that basically a priest who was standing at the side altar saying mass could see the priest at the high altar saying mass. If you go to a traditional Benedictine house like Fongombo in France, or one of their or Vandril, or one of their sister houses, early in the morning you will see the priest monks offering their private masses all around the abbey church. Fongombo, that's I think something like 30 or 40 side altars. So that's 30 or 40 priests celebrating mass, private masses individually, with a server each, and they have one sacrum bell. So there's one monk in the center of the tower, and their elevations at the consecration all take place at the same time, and one sacrum bell, one big bell from the tower, rings out to tell the world that God is here in the Blessed Sacrament. But how they achieve that is because from each side altar the priest can see the next priest saying mass, and so on and so forth, all the way around the church, so that everything is timed. Now, why am I telling you that? That's a good question. Oh yes, Why am I telling you that? Because of this idea of a window, of your tablet or your phone or your PC, whatever, as a spiritual window. Remember that icons, the reason why icons usually, traditionally, the reason why the background of an icon is gold. Trying to see if I've got one easy to hand. Ooh, not sure if you can see it very well here, but generally icons, of course, have a gold background. The reason why they have a gold background is because it denotes the heavenly. The idea, of course, the concept, the idea of an icon being a window through to the divine, a window through, as it were, to the heavenly realm. So by extension, we might take our phone, our phones, our tablets, whatever, where we watch Mass. For Mass, for example, watching Mass online, we might place them between candles, between our statuary, and consider them as a spiritual window to that live offering of Mass. Now, I spoke last week about why we ought to watch online Masses live, because we can, in real time, spiritually unite ourselves with the sacrifice of Calvary that is being offered at that moment, at that time. Remember, I was saying that I don't see the point much of watching a recorded Mass, because it might be edifying to hear the prayers and the lessons. It might be edifying to hear the homily. It certainly might inspire us to think of God and to worship God, but we can't unite ourselves spiritually with that act of worship because it's been and gone. We're only watching a recording. It's been and gone. We can't literally pray with the celebrant of that Mass. We can't literally unite ourselves with that offering of the Eucharist because it's been and gone. Whereas with a live offering of Mass, we can actually intend spiritually to unite ourselves in real time with that act of worship as it is being offered. So if we were to do that with our phones or with our iPads, and if we were to place them within our prayer corner, surrounded by religious objects, it may just help us to think of them less as a phone and an iPad, and instead as a spiritual window, rather like the squint, which is the name for that hole in the wall between the side altar through to the chancel, that the priest could see the other priest saying Mass. To be like a squint, to be like a window into the church. Because we know with a live Mass that what we are seeing is happening in real time. Technically there may be perhaps a 10 upwards of 20-second delay, perhaps. But essentially, it's in real time. Essentially, we're seeing it at the same time. So we can actually unite ourselves spiritually with that act of worship. And we should, and we ought. And of course, to facilitate that, turn your phone on silent. Perhaps turn off the notifications, etc., so that literally turn your phone or your iPad into an icon, as it were, into a window onto live worship. And if you haven't done that before, can I suggest that you try it? Try it. We, of course, broadcast Mass every day, 8:30 a.m. GMT. Try it. Put lit candles around, or tea lights or whatever. Put a crucifix there, put an icon there, whatever. And place your phone, turn off, all the noisy settings, so that, you can't be interrupted by a phone call or a text or whatever. Turn the notifications off. I think you could even have it on airplane mode and still have Wi-Fi. Not sure. I'm not brilliant on those sort of things. But anyway, set it in such a way that for that time period you minimize disruptions and interference. And by placing it away from yourself and amidst your religious paraphernalia, you actually are then divorcing somewhat yourself from it as your otherwise extension of your hand and ear. And by placing it amidst your religious paraphernalia, it is becoming itself a religious item. And as I say, think of it as an icon, a living icon, an icon into the eternal worship of heaven that is taking place where that Mass is being said, where that Mass is being offered. And then you can unite yourself spiritually to that act of worship. And that will do you no end of good. And as I've also said in that other series, adopt the traditional customs of worship whilst worshipping that way. So kneel, stand, say the responses, vocalize the responses, join in with the hymns, if there's or the chants or whatever, but do everything to imagine that you are there. You know, conceptually in your mind, in your head, imagine yourself there. Try to, as it were, go beyond the limitations of the window to imagine that you are in the pew, or depending on the angle of the shot, maybe you're in the choir loft, whatever. But you see what I'm saying? You understand what I mean? Try to immerse yourself in that act of worship. So you see, to my mind, the pandemic, this COVID, ought to have been, and I hope it has been for many Christians, an opportunity, because of not being able to go to work and so on and so forth. It's provided time out. I don't know how many times people have said to me in the past, "Oh, well, I haven't got time, Father. I haven't got time for this. I haven't got time for that. Or I haven't got time to pray. I haven't got time to read the scriptures. I haven't got time." COVID, of course, has presented and given an increased opportunity for many people of time out. And I hope that Christians have utilized that time. But there are, of course, among us, people slightly older than us, who perhaps are retired, for whom, apart from the restrictions of not being able to go out and about, being retired, would generally be at home perhaps anyway. But for everyone, this has provided an opportunity to spend more time in prayer, to spend more time with God. And remember that the Christian faith is all about communion with God. That's the whole point of being a Christian. That's the whole point of our faith, is it is about realizing communion with God, a relationship with God, but communion with God. And of course, not just with God, but with each other. The Christian faith is communal. It is received communally. The faith is received communally. We receive it from others. It is experienced communally. It is shared. It is lived. And that includes, of course, praying and studying, etc. Now, so even though many of us have been isolated from others because of the restrictions, nonetheless, the wonders of modern technology, like these phones and things, have enabled many to experience perhaps even a deeper and a more frequent level of communion and fellowship with others than they would otherwise normally experience. Certainly, I know for many that the opportunity to experience online worship, and if done in the way that I've suggested, they certainly would get much out of that experience, both in a sense of realizing communion with God, as well as by extension, communion with all those others who are sharing in that act of worship at the same time. Some of you, I know, of course, share in our recitation of the Rosary every day. And that, for me, even though there is no Holy Communion, even though there is no spiritual act, sorry, even though there is no act of spiritual communion, in substitution for the Eucharist, even so, seeing and recognizing the same names and intentions, even for the Rosary, there is a sense of fellowship that we come together with. These same people have come together, and they are miles apart from each other. I have the ability at this end, as it were, to see where people are tuning in from. And there are Christians from all over the world tuning into the Daily Rosary, tuning into the Daily Mass. And what's incredible for me, what's mind-blowing for me, is the fact that in real time, so we can experience, although we're miles apart, we can experience in real time the same act of worship. We can be saying the same prayers. We can even be sharing the same intentions as we do in the Rosary. All at the same time and in real time. We are literally experiencing communion spiritually together, even though we're not physically anywhere near each other. I think that's a wonderful thing. As I said last week, I know there are many who can't wait to get back to the physical church, and great. I mean, neither can I. Well, I've never left it. I've been blessed to have the opportunity, of course, to go every day in order to offer the Mass. But I know there are, a great many people who have missed going to church, and there are a great many people who are worried that people won't go back to church. But my concern has been, as I said last week, that not many people, I don't think, have had the opportunity to really appreciate and realise the spiritual fellowship and communion that they could have done through this medium, and by which I mean to encourage you to do. And I think going forward, this should become a part of the Christian experience. And you see, aside from acts of worship, of course, Bible studies, discussions, lectures, conferences, all the rest of it, all these sorts of things can be done via this medium. And of course, during Lent, our schedule in Lent, we will be offering that opportunity via Zoom, which will, create an opportunity for people across the world to come together to study the faith and the scriptures in real time. Incredible. I think this is an amazing tool. But like anything, it can be abused. Like anything, it can be taken for granted. Like anything, it cannot be fully appreciated. And that's something that, as Christians, particularly when it comes to worship, particularly when it comes to communion, both with God and with each other, that's something we as Christians should never do. Rather, we should always be looking for ways and looking for opportunities to experience communion with God and experience fellowship and communion with each other. So you see, then, that if Christianity were outlawed tomorrow, hopefully, there could be a wealth of evidence, certainly within your home, that might indicate that a Christian lives here. And I hope some of you will consider, if you don't already, placing some overt symbol that others outside could see that indicates that your home is a Christian home. But I hope, too, that by Christian hope, we mean temple, we mean meeting place with God, we mean a place of communion with God. Something that's happening not just internally within ourselves, but something that is being lived out, being expressed in, and the proof, the evidence for that would be a domestic shrine, a home altar, a prayer corner, an icon corner, a locus, a focus, a place which not just speaks, but screams, God is here among us. God dwells here. This is a meeting place with God. And I hope that any external sign that you might think about doing would itself, of course, then convey, by extension, that hope and that charity, as well as our faith, to those who go past and those who come to our doors, to indicate that this is a place where God is. Now, some of you, of course, will know the translation of the hymn that I've chosen as the theme tune, as it were, for this series. Ubi caritas et amor, Deus ibi est. Well, I just want to read to you the whole hymn, because not very often we hear the whole hymn. It's not that long. And the various settings generally are only of the first stanza, the first verse. There are only 3 verses, but it's generally of the first verse. Otherwise, the hymn really isn't heard unless one hears it when it's traditionally sung in the Latin liturgy, which is in Holy Week, in the service called the Mandatum, when the priest or the bishop washes the feet of 12 men in token of Christ washing the feet of the disciples. That's when in the liturgy this hymn Ubi Caritas would normally occurs. But let me read to you the 3 verses of the whole hymn. And because this is the reason why I chose it as the kind of theme tune for our introduction, and really what undergirds the whole concept of this series, so that lines from this hymn will make up the episode titles. Today's title, of course, is Ubi Caritas et Amor Deus ibi est, which means where charity and love are, there God is. So the hymn carries on, where charity and love are, there God is. The love of Christ has gathered us into one. Let us exult and in him be joyful. Let us fear and let us love the living God. And from a sincere heart, let us love each other and him. Where charity and love are, there God is. Therefore, whensoever we are gathered as one, lest we in mind be divided, let us beware. Let cease malicious quarrels, let strife give way, and in the midst of us be Christ our God. Where charity and love are, there God is. Together also with the blessed may we see gloriously thy countenance, O Christ our God, a joy which is immense and also approved through infinite ages of ages. Amen. Wonderful words, wonderful hymn, but one particularly, of course, those first lines, I think, should be redolent, should speak to our own homes, where love and charity reside. God is there. As I said last week, the phrase, charity begins at home. The whole of our lives as Christians is all about charity. Why? Because, as St. John tells us, God is love. God is charity. And our lives as Christians must be all about charity. And so, certainly, where our treasure is, which is generally speaking where our homes are. I mean, okay, these days we might use banks more to put our actual treasure in, but you know what I'm saying. Generally speaking, you know, our home is where the heart is, we say, don't we? And traditionally we say charity begins at home, and therefore, you know, our homes as Christians should be dwelling places of God who is love, who is charity. God who is love and charity, who should dwell within us. We who have been made temples for the Spirit by virtue of our baptism. We then, wherever we are ourselves, as St. Peter says, living stones of the mystical body of Christ. We are the church. We are the meeting place of God. And our homes then, which, normally are so precious to us, our homes, which are normally our places of security, our places of stability, our places of family, our places where our loved ones are, God should dwell, should he not? And should we not, as Christians, express and manifest the fact that we hope and desire, and that he does live, dwell among us in that place which is so important to us, our homes. So, if you haven't already, think seriously about having a dedicated, focused place of prayer. If you haven't already, consider what I've suggested about setting things up to spiritually participate in online worship, such that you can literally worship. You can literally join yourself with that act of worship that you are watching, which you are watching in real time. Think about how can you express, how can you manifest, both inside and to others outside your home, that God dwells here, that charity and love dwell here. Because don't we want our homes to be full of love, to be full of charity? Don't we want our homes to be places of safety, of warmth, of hospitality, of friendship? Why have we developed this notion of separating God, who is and should mean all of those things, from our homes? It should be the other way round, should it not? God should be with us in our homes. And we should not think it a strange thing. We should not think it a weird thing. We should not think it an over-religious thing. And we should not overthink it. But we should make a point of making our homes a place where God dwells, where the awareness of the reality of God, who is everywhere, is made present, is made tangible, is made realizable, just in the same way that our churches do. Just in the same way that our churches are decorated and arranged in such a way as to engender that sense of the other, that sense of the spiritual, that sense of the divine, to take us out of the humdrum world and draw our eyes and the spirits and our souls toward heaven. But we can have such experiences at home as well. There's no reason why we shouldn't. And especially when most of our lives are lived in our homes. When we're not at church and we're not at work, where are we? We're at home. And where most of our prayers should be offered at home. Prayers when we rise, prayers before we go to sleep, prayers during the day, sanctifying our day. And to that, of course, I've suggested before that we might set ourselves alarms. Again, you can use your phone or your iPad or your IT for something useful. Use it to set alarms that go off periodically through the day. You might do one every hour, every waking hour, or you might do one every 2 hours or 3 hours. 3 hours is quite traditional. But prompts, reminders to pray, to include God in your life, to recognize God's presence in your life. And so be blessed and receive his grace through acknowledging and through being aware and awake to God's love, so that you then can not only experience God's love, but share God's love Share it with others. Now, of course, Lent is beginning on Ash Wednesday, this Wednesday coming. Yes, there will be broadcast Mass online at 8:30 as usual, GMT, the traditional Latin Rite Mass for Ash Wednesday with the blessing of ashes. The distribution, meaning myself, because nobody else is going to be there, and for parishioners, by the way, as with chalking at Epiphany, ashes is something that is a sacramental that could be administered in token another time. So we might do that on the following Sunday, for example. But it is the beginning of Lent, and for Lent, we have devised a schedule because it is the purpose of this channel of Old Roman TV to assist and to help you as Orthodox Catholics and Christians to live a God-centered, God-aware, God-blessed life. Some of you will know, of course, that generally on the hour throughout the waking day, from 6 a.m. through to 10 p.m. at night, a video appears posted in our social media from this channel as a prompt, as a reminder, little messages, little suggestions, etc., as to make us think of God. But in addition to that, in Lent, so every day in Lent, from Wednesday, in addition to the kind of normal periodic videos that appear through the day, there will be Mass, of course, at 8:30. At midday, when we air the Angelus, that will be immediately followed by a short meditation by Bishop Richard Challoner, now deceased. He wrote a book full of meditations for every day of the year in the, I think, late 17th century. But we're going to read the meditation for each day that he has written immediately after the Angelus. Shouldn't take any longer than 10-15 minutes. At 3 p.m. We're going to have a live broadcast called Breaking Fast. That's going to be with me. It may occasionally feature others, but certainly on the whole, I imagine it's going to be mostly just me. And as it were, that is just going to be an opportunity to tune in with each other and just check in on each other. Okay, so that will be an opportunity. So please interact at 3 p.m. Breaking Fast. Now, why 3 p.m. Breaking Fast? Because traditionally in the Latin Rite, one would break fast. So one would fast all morning through the early afternoon, and then the earliest time for breaking fast was about 3 p.m. Now, I'm not actually going to, well, I'm going to break fast slightly because I probably will have a cup of tea and I just may have an oatmeal biscuit, but I won't have a meal. I will have a meal later in the evening, just one meal a day. I'm going to do this Lent. But breaking fast at 3 p.m. is just going to be a chat. So it's just going to be me with a cup of tea, maybe an oatmeal biscuit, and hopefully you, and we're just going to chew the cud for just a few minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something like that, just to check in and see how our Lent is going. Maybe share some ideas, maybe share some anecdotes, whatever. But that's the 3 p.m. that's going to be, and that'll be wherever I am. So, yeah. Anyway, then at 6 o'clock, of course, we got the Angelus, and we will still have the Rosary following. And then in the evening at 10 p.m., we're going to have a guided examen. Now, some of you, of course, will already be aware of my general commendation that we should all practice an examination of conscience at the end of each day. The channel already does a prompt at 10 p.m, a short video inviting you, reminding you to perform an act of contrition and an examination of conscience before you go to bed. So instead of that little video through Lent, this mug is going to appear at 10 p.m. With suggestions for a guided examination of conscience. Now, please understand that I will not be expecting you to interact live with the examination of conscience. Please do not post in the comments your faults and your failings. I'm not going to be able to give you absolution. So, bear that in mind. It's literally, I'm just going to suggest to you for a period of about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, questions to ask oneself to inculcate a discipline of performing this examination of conscience at the end of every day. An opportunity, you see, before going to bed, of recognizing our faults, our failings, our weaknesses, and our strengths, and so that we can do better the next day, so that we can grow in our Christian life, we can grow in our spiritual life, we can grow and deepen in our relationship with God. And at the end of that examination of conscience, I will invite whoever's watching to make an act of contrition. We will say the act of contrition together. So that's going to be our daily schedule. Then, in addition, there will be other broadcast worship and conferences. Fridays at 3 p.m. Will be Stations of the Cross. And I think on Saturday mornings there will be an adult catechism. So I'm still finalising some things, so look out for the schedule when it's advertised. But the whole point of that is really, again, to utilise this medium so that none of us have to feel that we are alone. None of us have to feel that we are alone in the practice of our faith, but that we can have these times of interaction, what kind of interaction, and I hope that we can share the journey and the progress of Lent together, to sustain each other, to encourage each other, and to increase our faith, our hope, and above all our charity and our sense of charity in communion with God and with each other. So, the next broadcast on this channel, of course, will be Mass tomorrow morning, which is Feria of Quinquagesima. So it'll be an opportunity again to hear those wonderful words of St. Paul, which should be the motivation for our approach to Lent in his Canticle to Charity from that first letter of St. Paul, from that first letter of Corinthians, chapter 13. So we'll be able to reflect on that for one last time before then on Wednesday we enter into the holy season. So bless you for watching. As always, do let me know if this was interesting. Give me feedback, much appreciated. Just so I know I'm not wasting your time, not necessarily mine. And if you have any questions, of course, as well, please also do feel free to share those. You can either post in the comments, or depending on which platform you're on, just click on the host, and you should be able to get a message to me that way. Otherwise, as I say, take care of yourselves, look out for others, and of course, as always, and never forget, always remember, God loves you.
Ubi caritas et amor, Deus sibi est, congregavit nos in unum Christi Amen.